All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next one on Elon Musk. Man, Elon poking the bear and making a lot of people have their masks off. Now, I'm not going to defend Elon's proposal necessarily, but let's start with this. We'll put it up there on the screen.
Nor the wisdom of using a Twitter poll to do foreign diplomacy.
Right. Anyway, here's Elon out of the blue. Tweets this: Ukraine-Russia peace, redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. Number 2, Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783, until Khrushchev's mistake. Number 4, water supply to Crimea assured. Number 5, Ukraine remains neutral. He follows up, quote, this is highly likely to be the outcome in the end, just a question of how many die before then. Also says, quote, also worth noting if a possible, albeit unlikely, outcome from this conflict is nuclear war. Now, look, there are a couple of things that you could say about this, which I would say you can critique in good faith. Number 1, the idea of any free and fair election in these regions after Russia has occupied it and depopulated it of any pro-Ukrainian forces. Even if the election was free and fair, all these pro-Ukrainians are either dead or they're in Poland or in the eastern part of the country. Like, you can't have a quote-unquote free and fair election after you forcibly removed the part of the population that would have voted for it. Now, again, it's not to say that many of these people don't want to be a part of Russia. If you had held this a couple of years ago, I'm relatively certain they probably would have chosen to be Russian.
And that actually shows you that the person who is most responsible for, like, screwing up their chance at true independence or joining Russia is Putin. I mean, because he's made it he has made it impossible to have the type of referendums that could be potentially respected internationally.
But so that, I think, is probably the most objectionable part of it. But number 2, when he says Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as has been since 1783, look, I'm not going to use the term Khrushchev's mistake. That's literally a Russian term. So they can call it what, I don't give a damn about Khrushchev, former Soviet Union, whatever. I'm going to look at this and say, well, Russia's controlled it since 2013. The world basically accepted it. They were let back into the G7. It was a de facto acknowledgement by the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, even if nobody ever did it, in part, and basically everybody just learned to live with it. So maybe we just never formally recognize it, but also certain sanctions that are in place over that come away if you withdraw and keep, your forces in Crimea. I mean, that's where the Ukrainians need to get real. And that's actually why I wanted to do this is it shows to me how emboldened the Ukrainians are, at the very least publicly, to say that their most maximalist aims are the only things that they will accept. Because they ridiculed him for suggesting this, of which, if you said this in 2015, everyone would be like, yeah, it's true. Obama said this in 2014 or in 2016 in his famous interview with Jeffrey Goldberg. And guess what? It's like that was just a generally part of the accepted consensus. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I don't think it's just or right, but when the downside is nuclear war, then this is one that the international community had already accepted and has no reason to, quote unquote, backtrack on it, especially in a bitter negotiation. I just want to emphasize that again. This is not supposed to make anybody happy. This is supposed to avoid nuclear confrontation. So let's say that there are many, many problems. The spirit of it, though, is, hey, guys, let's try and settle this before the millions of people die and we possibly have nuclear Armageddon. And for this, Krystal, he was vilified by the Ukrainians to a degree which, frankly, I find repulsive. Let's put this up there on the screen. A Ukrainian ambassador to Germany responded immediately. The only outcome is that now no Ukrainian will ever buy your fucking Tesla crap. So good luck to you, Elon. And he also says, quote, fuck off is my very diplomatic reply to you. Now, first of all, you're a Ukrainian ambassador to Germany. You should probably direct that ire to the largest country in Europe, which has only given you $0.23 billion in aid. And yet, you're savaging a person who literally provided you free internet and enabled your country to mobilize against Russia in the Battle of Kyiv by providing you his infrastructure through his own goodwill. Nobody said Elon had to give you free internet. He actually did. And let's even take all of that out of it. If the Ukrainians are going to suggest that anybody who proposes any sort of bitter peace is pro-Russia, then they are manipulating our own domestic politics in terms of trying to advocate for something that may be in our interests and may be contrary to their most maximalist interests. And Zelensky also jumped in. So let's go ahead and put this next part up there on the screen. And this is actually the one I found the worst. He tweets, quote, "Which Elon Musk do you like more? One who supports Ukraine or one who supports Russia?" Saying that you want a bitter diplomatic solution is not supporting Russia. What did we have? What did we just spend an entire thing doing? Be like, the Russians are irresponsible. Their brinksmanship, nuclear saber rattling is threatening global security and millions of people. That it's not to say that you support them in order to try and deal, and exactly what you said earlier, with the reality that these crazy people also do have nuclear weapons and the ability to wipe us off the face of the globe. And in that face, we must at times do things that are terrible. You know, I was thinking a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think a lot of people forget this. There was a quid pro quo in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We gave up Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Not a lot of people know that because it wasn't really declassified until 40 years later. But here's the truth, folks. They took those missiles out of Cuba, and then a little bit while later, as we communicated to Khrushchev and said, look, we can't say this publicly, but behind the scenes, those missiles, they're gone. I mean, is that appeasement? Did John F. Kennedy, whose father, by the way, is the chief appeaser, who himself advocated for war with Hitler and the Nazi regime, wrote a famous book, did he, quote unquote, learn and repeat Chamberlain's mistake by avoiding nuclear war?
Right.
No. I mean, that's the reality. And I think this, I've been really thinking this, Kennedy lost his brother in World War II. Joseph P. Kennedy II was blown up over England. Kennedy himself suffered horrific back injury.
Plagued him for the rest
he
of his
had
life.
men who died in his arms after PT 109. He understood the reality of actual war. And I think that the people who are saber rattling and talking online about, oh, I'd be happy to go and to die, if I had to, you have no idea what it means. I mean, Dan Carlin said this on his podcast. I think it's so important, which is that whenever you're a couple decades removed from conflicts, you like to look at things in macro trends. You're like, well, and he specifically said this in his Mongol episode, where he said, look, now 700 years later, we're like, wow, but when the Mongols conquered China, it united them all under one thing. And then there was a global currency. And that was awesome for global trade. And he's like, yeah, but 10 million people died.
Right.
And he's like, and we all just kind of forget that.
And he's like, that away.
you can't just, move on past the mountain of skulls that somebody literally saw and the ground that was so wet with human fat that it was like muddy for months. This is real. This is real, okay?
Jesus.
And so it's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's true. Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire created the first currency union and paper currency, but a lot of people had to die in order for that to happen. I think that we are almost just so removed from what the reality of conflict is, Krystal, that we are getting to this point where we have unhinged discourse and we have the inability to assess our own interest in this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, even like Elon's Twitter diplomacy here is kind of a sign of that. That this all just, to so many people, it just feels like a game.
Yeah.
It feels like something you could like put on a Twitter poll on and like come to some sort of a like crowd-funded consensus rather than the reality of what this is. And then I almost, really, I don't blame the Ukrainians for the response. I really blame the U.S. for the Ukrainian response because we have allowed them to imagine that they could achieve this maximalist end.
That's true.
I mean, that's the reality. If we had put pressure on them from the beginning of like, no, there's going to be a ceasefire. No, we're going to have a peace deal. No, you are going to have to give up some of your territory. Their language would be a lot different here. And ultimately, this sort of maximalist idea of we're going to reclaim all of the territory, which, is unlikely to be the outcome ultimately if this war is ever going to end. This also creates an obstacle with the Ukrainian people to peace because then when, if Zelensky ever did sit down at a negotiating table and you have to make these sorts of bitter, hard, terrible concessions, well, the population is going to say, what the hell? You told us we were going to have it all back. This isn't something that we can stomach. This isn't something that we can, that we can ultimately accept. So I really sort of blame the US posture here of pretending like we're hands off, like we're just letting the Ukrainians do their thing, when in reality, the Ukrainians are doing exactly what we want them to do in terms of continuing this war indefinitely. And listen, I always put the caveats on here. It's not like Putin is in. He has created so many barriers to ever being able to get to a ceasefire, let alone some sort of negotiated peace. There is no doubt about it. I mean, at this moment, the idea of any sort of like working out a peace deal, and I think this is part of why Elon was mocked as well, it seems preposterous. I don't deny that whatsoever, given the actions that the Russian state has just taken here. But ultimately, you're going to have to find a way to get to that place so that this doesn't continue indefinitely and continue to risk escalation and ultimately nuclear war. I mean, there's just no other way to say this. The longer this goes on, the more likely we are to have some sort of nuclear weapon deployed. That's just reality. So we can all do everything we can, even if it seems as a long shot, to try to push for that negotiated settlement and that ceasefire to be put into place. Or we can just like sort of close our eyes and hope for the best, which is basically what we've been doing up to this point.
I've been thinking long and hard about this one. And I think I realize why the way that we speak is just so contrary to how a lot of other people think about this conflict. Because I think that you and I are coming at this, and have from the beginning, with a dispassionate view of what is in America's interests. And the foreign policy elite does not care about America's interests, or they do, but they are willing to subordinate them to a point and risk them while supporting Ukrainian interests. And I think that their ability to compartmentalize this is the disconnect, because I think we have to acknowledge a couple of basic things, which the honest hawks will say, which is that here's the truth. Ukraine's most maximalist aims are actually contrary to the interests of the United States. Might be crazy to think, but Ukraine's most maximalist aim is to recover Crimea. Well, that would almost certainly push us into an outright war with Russia. So at a certain point on the line, things cross where Ukraine's interests are here and America's interests are here. They diverge. The difference is that they are willing to push things all the way up until that line before we have some sort of attempted negotiated conflict. What you and I are saying is that the risk of getting to that line is so high and increases so incrementally that we are willing to pull the plug, quote unquote, and try and force negotiation right now rather than ever get to the point where we have Armageddon in the first place. And the only way that I can reconcile why somebody would be willing to do that is if they care so much about the security of Ukraine, like in the longest term.
I actually don't. I read it a little bit differently. I actually think it comes from arrogance and hubris of the type that we've seen routinely from the foreign policy establishment. I mean, in our lifetime, but also for generations before we came along. I mean, they thought they could go in and remake the Middle East. They thought they could go into Afghanistan and prop up this government. I mean, how did that work out? They thought that they could turn Iraq into a democracy and, not really, and disband the army, and that this was all go fine. I mean, the level of hubris that has been demonstrated by the foreign policy establishment and cheered on by a military-industrial complex that, of course, profits off of each and every one of these conflicts, I really think that is driving the flawed thinking that has led us to ultimately this place. And, they said pretty clearly at the start, like, Putin has to go. I mean, they effectively came out and said, our policy here is regime change. Mm-hmm. Think of the arrogance of that. Think of the hubris of that, given everything that we've learned. And again, I mean, sometimes I feel like we're repeating ourselves, but I also feel like we kind of have to repeat ourselves. You don't know what comes after Putin. Let's say you get, careful what you wish for. Let's say you get your wish. Let's say there's a, popular revolt and Putin is pushed down. It's just as likely you get someone who's more like Ramzan Kadyrov than that you get, a Navalny in there, okay? Right. So, and the societal chaos and fallout from such an action is also something to be very, wary of and very concerned about, not just for the people in Russia, who we should care a lot about, the ordinary citizens, who are suffering right now in Russia, but also for world stability and what happens next and, we're gonna destabilize the nuclear power. Like, what are you thinking about? But I honestly think that's where it comes from. It's from this arrogance of thinking they can just remake the world and shape it however they want and put in place the people that they think are going to work better with them and do the things they wanted to do. Putin himself is a cautionary tale there because he's the guy we wanted in there because we thought, he'd open the place up in the way we wanted to Western capital. And, lo and behold, look, it turns out he wasn't such a great guy after all, wasn't such a great partner after all, because we skipped the building of the democratic institutions in favor of pushing the economic shock doctrine that we wanted to be able to profit off of. So to me, that's where the disconnect ultimately comes from. And I can't tell you how frustrated I'm getting just watching this media narrative unfold that says the only position you are allowed to take is one that says Ukrainian maximal victory. The total absence, we're going to talk to Branko Marcetic about this today, the total absence of any sort of genuine peace movement that isn't seeking to take Russia's side or seeking to, take the Ukrainian side, even though the Ukrainian cause, that is the just cause, there is no doubt about it, but it's just looking to say, how do we end this conflict without putting everyone's lives in danger? And I even object to the idea that that's in America's interest. Yes, obviously it's in America's interest. It's in the world's interest. It's ultimately in Ukraine's interest because if there's a nuclear weapon deployed, and they're the ones who are going to face the fallout first. So even this idea that, ultimately there's this big split between what would be good for the US and what would be good for the rest of the world or what would be good for Ukraine, I think the entire world has a very vested interest in keeping us from ending up at nuclear war.
Yeah, I think it's all well said. I agree with you. I feel deeply frustrated about it as well.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.